Hello and welcome to Unpacking Us. I'm your host, Asad Liaquat, and I'm very excited to bring you another episode of the podcast. In the previous episode, we talked about generative AI and the ways in which it does or doesn't represent those in the global south well. Today, we're going to focus on more traditional forms of AI or machine learning. And in particular, we're going to talk about the inequitable outcomes that often result from application of ML algorithms in the global south with respect to gender or other social categories. We'll discuss what it is about these systems that leads to these inequitable outcomes and what can be done better. I'd like to welcome our guest for today, Genevieve Smith. Genevieve is the founding co-director of the Responsible and Equitable AI Initiative at the Berkley AI Research Lab, and is also part of the faculty at Haas, the business school at Berkeley. She also wears many other hats, serving as the Gender and AI Fellow at USAID and leads research partnerships with big tech firms. Genevieve, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here.
So, our focus today is on the global south, but I'd like to start today's conversation on a more personal note. So, you have written about how you personally experienced a case of an ML algorithm displaying gender bias when you and your husband both applied for the same credit card. Can you please tell us what happened?
Yeah, sure. And this is also, something I didn't even really realize had happened until I saw the news article that it was in 2019 where a husband and wife had applied for the same Apple credit card, and the husband had received a limit that was something like 20 times higher than the wife's limit. And when they asked why that happened, because they'd applied with all of the same credentials and information and shared accounts, the credit card company had been unable to say why that was the case, and pretty much responded saying, well, the algorithm said this, and that's why it happened, but couldn't say as to why that was the case. So that caused a big media hurrah, and it was around that same time period that my husband and I had applied for the same credit card, and kind of a similar story that was echoed, which is that he got a higher credit limit despite similar application processes, and I wasn't able to understand why he had gotten a higher credit limit. And it was, again, kind of something that was informed by an algorithm, but very unclear and kind of opaque as to what exactly had happened. So it was interesting to see my story echoed by another story in the media, and just really a reminder of the different ways that machine learning is impacting our lives and present in our lives in ways that we don't fully understand or recognize many times.
Yeah, what strikes me often is how omnipresent ML algorithms are in our lives, in avenues that we don't understand, right? And this is true in the global north and the global south, right? And so in your work, you have highlighted a lot of these examples in the U.S., in Europe, and then also in the global south. So, what would you say are some of the kind of the key examples of inequitable outcomes that we know have occurred in the global south? And I guess, like, do you also have a view on whether this is kind of more common or more problematic in the global south versus the global north?
Yeah, and I'm really happy to have this conversation because I think it is one that doesn't happen enough, thinking about some of the implications and impacts of AI in the global south. And I would say, I think around what are some of the, key outcomes or challenges when it comes to the global south. I mean, I think they're very similar to the ones that are happening in the global north. It's just that a lot of times we're not having those types of conversations. I think there's a big narrative around AI being implemented, especially when we're talking about these more discriminative AI systems that are more traditional versus the generative AI systems. Um, they're implemented in under kind of these AI for good types of initiatives, and I think sometimes that lexicon can lead us to not examining thoroughly enough the potential unintended consequences of these types of technologies. And so I also do research around machine learning based credit assessment tools in the global south, which are filling a really important gap, which is that about 1.5 billion people globally are unbanked or underbanked. So they don't have access to finance. And this is linked to histories of exclusion from formal financial systems for a variety of reasons. And women are predominantly ones that are unbanked. again, linked to different biases that can exist in formal financial systems. So machine learning really opens up new opportunities for financial inclusion. But at the same time, there are different ways that bias can be embedded within these tools, and we need to really be aware that of those different ways that it can happen. And happy to talk through, some of those different methods and mechanisms. I will also say, to your point around the previous episode around generative AI in the global south, we actually just finished a research project that was looking at linguistic bias in ChatGPT, and specifically GPT 3.5 and GPT-4. And we looked at 10 different English language varieties globally, because there's this presumed assumption that ChatGPT is excellent in English. So we wanted to understand, but what about for Kenyan English, Indian English, different forms of English globally? And we found that ChatGPT or GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 default to quote unquote standard American English. So they're more likely to respond in standard, or they do respond in standard American English, and they're more likely to have outputs that are seen as discriminatory, stereotyping, and condescending in quote unquote non-standard English language varieties. So Kenyan English, Indian English, Scottish English, things like that, which has implications as we're starting to adopt these tools and integrate these different tools into various types of services. So just to note.
No, that's super interesting. So I guess on that point, I'm working with an edtech startup in Pakistan that's trying to build some chatbots to kind of speed up English language learning for teachers. And we're kind of grappling with some of these same issues that we're like relying on ChatGPT powered transcription of their Urdu to English, and that is kind of right now producing some like interesting outcomes that we're working with to figure out like what is the best way forward, facing some of these same challenges that you're describing. So that's super interesting, and I hope to talk about kind of that particular problem in a future episode as well. So you brought up kind of the case of providing credit to women in global south context. So in that case, I guess like I want to dig a little bit deeper on what could be the cause of some of these inequitable outcomes that we see. Is it the case that like we just don't have enough data on women because they haven't been part of the system, so it's just like hard to produce good predictions about women? Or is it like something about the system or society that's more at blame?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important question. And also just to note, I'm not all doom and gloom when it comes to AI in the global south, right? I mean, I do think that, just as an important caveat, right? I do think there is huge potential in leveraging AI for different types of outcomes, educational outcomes that you mentioned. They're critical things to keep in mind, but also really big potential. For climate change and resilience and helping inform different climate strategies. I think there's a lot of really exciting things happening. But yeah, I also don't think that we're necessarily thinking about the unintended consequences enough and proactively building to anticipate those so that we can create more equitable outcomes. So, in terms of what the cause of some inequitable outcomes can be, and thinking about the financial inclusion space and thinking about the credit assessment space, there are a couple of different reasons for this. I think that in terms of, do we is it that we don't have enough data so it's hard to produce good predictions? I don't think that is so much the case. For these particular types of technologies, the ways that they work are that they're predominantly in the form of apps. So they're apps that people can download from Google Play, because Android is the most common, versus iPhone, which is more expensive. And so get download from Google Play and then essentially grant permission to the app to look at most data on one's cell phone. And there's a lot of data that these different fintechs and these different tools have access for. I will say that it appears as though there are, given gender digital divides in the global south, it is men tend to be getting loans more, and perhaps there's also a piece around they're applying for loans more, and so there can be something around, there may be more data related to men, so perhaps there's a greater accuracy when it comes to men. But I don't think that's so much the reason for the inequitable outcomes. I think it's really more around just the fact that data can be gendered, and features and proxies that machines can learn from can be gendered. And so when we think about something like financial inclusion and access to finance, that's a very gendered space, right? I mean, women have historically, and we're talking in, let's say, India or Kenya, which are really big markets for these types of technologies, they have historically not had as much access to finance as male counterparts. And this is linked to all sorts of different things in India, which is considered to be more gender inequitable according to the Gender Gap Index. Women tend to get married fairly young and be part of the move to the man's village and be part of that household. And men are more likely to be the breadwinners, which is common in lots of places, more likely to also control the household finances. So there's all these different types of things in society that these machines can also learn from. And so what really matters, when something that I found in my research is that, interestingly, even though more men are getting access to these loans and having higher loans, women are actually more likely to repay and repay on time. So it kind of starts to illustrate that perhaps how we're thinking about creditworthiness is flawed and has this reflection of, gender inequities in society that aren't true realities around what creditworthiness means in one's actual ability and willingness to repay a loan. So I think it highlights that we might need to rethink how we're thinking about the concept of creditworthiness.
When you were describing just like a lack of credit history that these women have, right? And so like the algorithm is perhaps kind of taking into account that there's not enough history to go by. And so that, taking that into account, it's more likely, it's basically saying the repayment probability is probably higher for men just because they have a longer history of financial transactions than women, right? But when you're saying you find that like when you do start giving loans to women, then the repayment frequency may be higher. And I was thinking of the period of like, I don't know, 20, 30 years when which like microfinance was a huge thing. I think it still is, and the microfinance that I'm thinking of is like based on like a lot, like very deep person to person contact, right? When these microfinance agents go to a village, like get to know people and then give out loans predominantly to women based on these deep ties. And and essentially like the repayment is guaranteed by these social networks as well. And in that case, like my understanding from the literature is that one, repayment rates are extremely high, that women turn out to be extremely trustworthy. And this is a way in which, I think it's a good example of the contrast between like what could be the counterfactual if these ML algorithms weren't making the decisions, right? And this is a case of like, you could have a model, or I guess we've had models, which is probably a more costly model in which like we have like more investments in those like personal connections. And then on the alternative, we have, let's just like take a look at the person's behavior on digitally and make decisions based on that. Do you have a sense of like going forward, like in your work, the relative like costs and benefits of these two approaches? Like is the move towards making these decisions algorithmically just kind of inevitable, or are these like are these decisions like reversible in some contexts?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And one thing I'll note is that it's like one of your first points. It's not necessarily that these algorithms are learning from like histories of financial exclusion. A lot, just to clarify, a lot of the tools, they will enter a market and they'll just distribute a bunch of loans randomly and see who repays, and then use that to kind of inform the features and proxies that the algorithm then learns from. So it's less about kind of like histories of financial exclusion that are baked into these tools. I think it's more around um, just like, not to get too like nerdy into the specifics of it, but I think it's more around how these tools are essentially assessing one's ability to repay, which is how much money you have, job stability, cash flow, stuff like that, in addition to one's willingness to pay, which is one's behavior, trustworthiness, things like that. And I think it's actually encoding ability to repay as like income and job stability, which in many locations, men have higher incomes. They might have more formal jobs, versus women more often in informal economies. And so it's encoding those types of gender differences, um, which impact who then gets a loan or who's deemed as more creditworthy. But if you have a micro loan, having a that doesn't necessarily dictate, whether or not you have like a formal job does not necessarily dictate whether you'll actually repay this loan. So I think that's kind of actually where perhaps it's coming from, is there's some like gendered aspects of like features and proxies that
And
are.
are they able to incorporate like familial ties in some way? Because it is the case that like you have access to a network that
Mhm.
also affects your ability to pay. Is that something that in your experience is accounted for?
Yeah, that's definitely part of what goes into the algorithms too, is like who, how many, what, who's in your network, how close you are to your family, like how many contacts you have, because that, yeah. So, and that could be gendered as well. One's network can be gendered, and again, depends on, the country and gender gaps and things as well. But a lot of this stuff is gendered, that just becomes encoded in different ways in these tools. And I think in some ways they can be, quote unquote accurate, in that there is like an aspect of that can be linked to creditworthiness. But there's also, I think, creditworthiness is interesting. So it's such an American concept, and like whether someone will actually repay a loan is like it can be like a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. So it's really hard to actually even understand like what is like accurate in some of these cases. But anyways, but yeah, and to your other point around like, the relative costs and benefits of different approaches, and the move to making decisions algorithmically, and is that inevitable? Um, I certainly think that there's this pressure related to, being more efficient, um, you know, being being able to unlock new opportunities, these kind of like market-driven incentives that are pushing towards this sentiment that moving towards algorithmic decisions is a bit inevitable. Um, I don't think that it is inevitable, but I think that, a lot of the incentive structures are, towards greater productivity and efficiency, are making it seem like it is. Um, and I also don't think that incorporating, algorithms into aspects of human decision making is necessarily a bad thing, but it needs to be done responsibly, and happy to talk through like what I see as some of the strategies for that. Um, and I guess just that like a high level to kind of conclude this like initial part on challenges and problems. I think the main thing to keep in mind, and that for folks that are developing or managing different algorithms to keep in mind, is that, machine learning tools are reflections of society that we live in, right? They're pattern recognition machines. And so they're going to learn from inequities that exist in society. And we need to be really mindful of what they are learning from and what we are predicting into the future, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
I wanted to bring up one reason why in some countries people prefer algorithmic decision is because of this long history of corruption and nepotism in many decisions. And so there is this notion that like if we can reduce human involvement in a decision, and if a decision is done by a machine, then it's less likely to be biased. And people often rely on that as a crutch of being like, look, there's nothing I can do. Just like in your case of the credit card limit being different, it's like there's nothing I can do. It's this machine that made this decision, right? But then obviously what's striking about this is that that machine is a human creation, and so a lot of our biases are feeding into it, but it's almost like allowing the decision makers, like people who've designed the system, to shirk away from responsibility. One more thing that I want to touch on is the idea of like incentives to look at these biases, incentives to correct these biases. One thing that's inevitable in a lot of product development is that you're often working against quick timelines. There's often no one you're accountable to directly if your algorithm produces inequitable outcomes, and so it's kind of nobody's job often to look at this. Is that part of the problem in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge challenge is the working against quick timelines. I think also in development, a lot of those that are developing and scaling AI technologies are getting investment, which is, a good thing, right? But there can be pressure from investors around delivering value and delivering or returning value in certain periods of time. And so that's certainly like a very real pressure that founders face, right? And there's trade offs, there's very real trade offs that exist. And who is accountable if produce inequitable outcomes? I think that's a really important question. And that's one that policymakers are really grappling with, right? It's like, how do we think about policy to govern these different types of technologies? And I do want to go back to one thing you said before, which is like long histories of nepotism, corruption, et cetera, and how machines have the ability to reduce bias. And that's totally true. Like in the example I provided around the financial inclusion and credit assessment tools, you know, they're providing access to people who are outside of financial folds for whatever reason. And part of those reasons are related to bias and, inequities that exist in formal financial systems. So there's certainly opportunities that machine learning and AI can play in helping to reduce some of the biases that exist in our current systems. I think one thing that makes me nervous is that a lot of these machine learning technologies can be, considered quote unquote black box, where it's really hard to dissect the ways that they made that decision. Going back to the credit card example, the very beginning of this, when the husband and wife asked, why had the limit been so much higher for the husband, and they couldn't answer. We don't fully understand the ways that these algorithms are outputting predictions and decisions, right? And that's, with generative AI tools and some of these large models, similarly, there's a uncertainty around how they're actually operating. And I think that's what makes me kind of nervous is that even though these tools can reduce bias and increase access to, you know, whatever it may be, which is really exciting and important, if we're not able to understand how that decision was arrived at, it's hard to then critique or get accountability or push back if you think that a decision was perhaps inaccurate or wrong or biased. And that's what makes me more nervous.
I hear you on this. I think there is like a sense of disempowerment that comes with not being able to tell. And if as builders, if the builders also feel that sense of disempowerment, then like the end user who was disenfranchised to begin with, they might even but they were in a world previously where they could, at least speak to a human about it if they could, right? Like there was some notion of like there's somebody out there who has answers and how do I reach them? But now the question is like nobody really knows, and so
Yeah,
everybody might end up feeling disempowered in that sense. So that is scary. Yeah. Let's move on to talking about uh, solutions. And so I want to hear from you from, I guess, a practitioner lens or from a policy lens. What do you think practitioners should be mindful of? What kind of policy solutions exist? What do you think are the best ways to kind of mitigate some of these problems?
totally. And I love talking about solutions. I think there's a lot of different types of solutions. There's so much exciting research and work that's being done in this space as well. And I like the openness around being able to talk about the challenges and problems, because then we can start talking about the solutions, right? As opposed to saying, oh well, it's better, so let's just leave it at that. It's like, okay, it's better, but or it's less biased than maybe what exists, but also can still be biased. So what can we do to solve for this, help build some of these accountability structures, et cetera? So I love that. um, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind, a couple categories to keep in mind. And this is kind of related to, the proliferation of different like AI principles that came about. So a lot of AI principles started in 2016, started to proliferate globally, both in companies and nonprofits and multilaterals around how AI should be developed, designed, and governed. And they kind of coalesced around a couple, and I think they're really important ones to think in mind. And then the solutions can kind of revolve around some of these. Um, but fairness, so thinking about fairness and bias considerations, um, privacy, so thinking about data privacy considerations, um, transparency, thinking about transparency, and safety and security. And then the last one is around accountability. So for each of those, you can think about some different types of solutions, tools, et cetera, that can be developed to mitigate some of the different problems that exist. But bigger than that, what I'm really interested in is kind of at a higher level around kind of who is developing and designing these different types of technologies, and how do we incorporate the empowerment and agency of more marginalized groups in the design, management, and ownership of these types of technologies. I'm really inspired by more of movements towards participatory design and human-centered AI, um, because I think a lot of these like challenges, problems are linked to power and, like you said before, like accountability and kind of who gets to decide, what is designed and developed, and what kind of data these tools learn from, and what are the features and proxies that then are built into these types of tools. So I think who develops and design these tools and technologies matters. So um, yeah, so I'm really inspired about interventions, especially in the development space, that are looking at how to utilize participatory design into the ways that technology and AI solutions are designed and developed, and really thinks critically too about ownership and making sure that technologies are not extractive. I think there's this concept of like data colonialism and like AI colonialism that we have to be super mindful of in the international development space, in which, data can be really extractive, and thinking about like how are benefits distributed. So, anyways, I took a couple turns in that answer. So sorry if I went too many places there, but yeah, happy to dive in any of those.
No, that's great. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into participatory design. So this is, I guess, this is a notion that I've heard being described often, and I'd love for you to get a little bit deeper into like how in practice that might work. And I guess like some of the questions that I have related to this are like, technically speaking, what are the gaps in the conversation that you may have with like members of a community who may not be kind of that familiar with the technology, to be able to kind of get some of their feedback into the system, right? So for instance, if we keep talking about your example of giving loans to men and women in a setting where women are frequently not part of the financial system, um, like, let's say there's like engineers designing the system, there's like data scientists like trying to get all the data in one place, who are not aware of the local context, that they're sitting in Silicon Valley, or they're sitting in some capital city in some developing country, and they don't really understand what goes on locally. And then there's the end users who are not very well versed in technology, who don't understand how their data flows through these systems. How would that conversation go, and how would it go beyond, because you've seen models of like, let's go get feedback from folks, right? And that ends up being like a box ticking exercise often. So how does a well designed participatory design effort look like?
Such a good question. And you're so right that it can be participatory design can also be this check the box, potentially extractive activity where it's like, okay, you tell me how I should adapt this, and then I just, kind of don't report back and improve my technology, but maybe don't give you credit, or kind of redistribute some of those different benefits. And so I think it's really important to think about, what do we mean by participatory design? And this is something that I think the space has grappled with a lot. And I will say that this is also a pretty new, I mean, participatory design research is not new. But really thinking about like human-centered AI and participatory design in the context of AI in the global South, I think this is a pretty new space, and that's why I'm also really excited about it. I also draw so I think that there's this great book called Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein that talks through different principles for data feminism, and talks about participatory design and what that can look like in really meaningful ways. One example that I think is a really good one is by the authors of Data Feminism, so Catherine D'Ignazio. And what she did is she worked with activists in Mexico who were targeting feminicide, which is the killing of women. and which is very often underreported. It's an underreported phenomenon globally, and in Mexico, it's a really huge issue. And they worked with activists who were trying to bring awareness around the different around feminicide that's occurring. And they went through several iterations and workshops with activists in this space to design a machine learning tool that helped identify news instances of feminicide so that they could better track and account for the different ways and examples of a woman that were being killed in the country, so to then be able to use towards policy and other interventions. So that's a really cool example that you can also learn more about in um, in Catherine D'Ignazio's latest book around feminicide and data feminism. And so in terms of like thinking about it practically, there are real challenges that you mentioned, in terms of people in that, especially when we're talking again about the global south. So like even, data feminism, it wasn't necessarily looking at some of the most marginalized communities. We're talking about machine learning based credit assessment tools, and we're talking about people who are in villages in areas in rural Kenya or India. How do you engage them meaningfully and technology and AI technology design when that's like a pretty foreign concept. um, so I think there's like a couple of different ways that it can work. And it's also important to make sure that what is the problem that we're solving, and at a high level, is AI the best solution for that? Having that, like, because that might, maybe it's not. And so I think there's an element of, if you're really doing participatory design in a way that is um, centering communities, you have to be open to the fact that AI might not be the solution for that particular problem. So that can be tough too as researchers, right? Because our incentives, like thinking about like incentive mechanisms for researchers in addition to developers, like it all can intersect and be kind of complicated. But that aside, I think there's a couple of different things. One is practically engaging with different groups. So in the context of like financial inclusion, maybe working with women's groups and asking them, how do you determine how loans are provided? And, thinking about what are the kind of like features and proxies that are used to determine creditworthiness in the context of, some of these different types of contexts. And so using different types of design thinking activities can be helpful to kind of bring out some of these different concepts, and then kind of working with them around, what would technology in this realm look like. It's complicated for sure though, and like I said, I think that we have ideas for some of these different types of experiments. But yeah, I think one challenge you mentioned before is like, how do we really, especially for working with really marginalized communities who might not really understand like what AI technology is. I think there's an educational aspect that has to come along with that as well.
You mentioned accountability as one key kind of, category that we should think about here. Are we thinking about like policy provisions that a government may have, or are we thinking about something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I think that I think this there certainly needs to be policy related to AI, and a lot of countries don't have mature program or approaches right now to thinking about policy and governance in the global south, and even even in the US and other places, right? um, because there needs to be some sort of mechanism to um, help account for some of these different trade-offs that can exist. And policy is meant to help protect citizens, especially in light of different types of trade-offs. And so we certainly need policy. I still think that there's a lot that practitioners can still do. um, but yeah, greater policy around thinking about different types of technologies and different aspects, from a fairness perspective and from a privacy perspective and transparency perspective. I think the EU AI Act is really interesting because they're, starting to think about like, what does it look like to protect citizens um, for different types of AI technologies using risk-based categorization. So I think that's a really interesting thing to do about it. But practitioners can also take it upon themselves to build more accountability structures, more opportunities to think about explainability, to for systems to users and things like that.
Thinking about like Gen AI in the US, for instance, it almost seems like companies are asking the government to regulate them, and the government is kind of saying, look, this is happening too fast, we're going to need a lot of time to to do any regulation. And so it almost seems like, neither practitioners nor governments are in a position to kind of take a lot of this very seriously. Either it's, kind of like technical constraints, or like, human resource constraints, or it's just like an unwillingness to take on some of these challenges. Is that your sense right now globally also, given that you've worked a lot in like, how tech leaders are thinking about this, how governments are thinking about this?
I think there's a real concern, and especially in kind of global South context, that regulation will impede innovation. And especially when we think about AI and the economic potential of AI, countries don't want to shoot themselves in the foot, so to speak, by im- putting into place regulation that can hold back innovation and hold back economic growth and job creation and like all these different types of things. So I think that's where attention rests, right? And even, you see that even in the US, there's this perceived tension and trade off between regulation and innovation. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. I actually think that regulation can be healthy for innovation, right? And that's also why companies are calling for regulation too, because you need to have a sense of the rules to be able to like innovate within those, because if regulation comes in a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever it might be, then there's all this backtracking, and that can make it much harder, and then companies can be liable for different things. So I think there could be this like false sense of one or the other, that I think is kind of holding back some of the regulation that we need. But I do find inspiration within the kind of the EU and just, in Europe, in terms of government taking this really seriously and thinking about like what does regulation in the space look like? And it's not perfect, but it's something, and it's starting to be, implemented, or it will be implemented and going into effect later this year. And so, yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. But in the global South, yeah, it's tricky, right? Because you don't want to fall behind. You don't want to fall behind. You're already behind, and you don't want to fall further behind by impeding, innovation and growth opportunities. But again, I think that can be a false trade-off, and that there is ways to have regulation while also supporting innovation in ways that are healthy and sustainable for citizens and society.
Great. As we're nearing the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask you if you have any suggestions for people who are listening, if they want to learn more, or if there's one action that you wish people would take um, on this issue, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is just to, depending upon where you're coming from. So maybe you're a developer of AI technologies, or maybe you're a manager of AI technologies, or maybe you're just an interested citizen or user of technologies. I think the main thing that I would recommend is just remembering that these technologies, they're not objective. They are not reflections of this objective reality. In truth, they are reflections of the society that we live in. And we have the opportunity to, think critically about what are we embedding within these technologies, and what would we prefer? What is the world that we want to live in? And how do we work with AI to get towards that world that we want to live in, that is more equitable and inclusive and sustainable and peaceful, and not accepting the status quo. So that would be the main thing. And I think, there's different readings that folks can do. I really like some articles with SSIR, has some really good ones around AI in the global South. I've written a couple, so shameless plug there.
What's the could you say what
Yeah,
SSIR
sure.
stands for?
Stanford Social Innovation Review has been doing some different. So I think that's a great kind of accessible place for different articles and actions around practitioners in the development space. Um, so those are just some things I would recommend, and for the funders and who are listening as well. Similarly, how can we invest not only in technological outputs, but how can we invest in inclusive and equitable processes in developing technologies? I think there's such a focus on what are we going to, how are we going to embed LLMs, large language models, or how are we going to create this AI tool to, combat this educational inequity or whatever it might be. There's such a focus on that output as opposed to a focus on the process by which that technology is developed. And so I would really encourage, if there's any funders who are listening or practitioners as well, to think really critically about and invest in the process and build in more opportunities for centering the agency and empowerment of the people that we're trying to impact.
I'll second your plug for the SSIR, and it was your article in the SSIR that kind of made me aware of your work in the first place. Thank you so much, Genevieve. It was a pleasure having you and talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear what you thought about this episode. Please leave a rating and a review on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. This really helps the podcast reach the right audience. You can also email me at asadliaquat@gmail.com with any feedback or any ideas you have for topics to cover or guests to invite. Hearing from people who are listening is a large part of what motivates me to record more episodes, so please don't hesitate to write. And thank you for listening.